on the topic of this special order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to remember the life of a former mayor, of a former Georgia state senator, of a former governor of Georgia, and as a former United States senator representing the state of Georgia, Mr. Zell Miller. Zell Miller passed away on March 23rd at the age of 86. He was born on February 24th, 1932 in Young Harris, Georgia, in Towns County. He was born to Bertie Bryan and Stephen Grady Miller. When Zell was 17 days old, his father died. His widowed mother raised her son and daughter, Jane, alone. In Young Harris, located in the North Georgia mountains, Miller's mother built a home for herself and her children with rocks she had hauled from a nearby stream. Mr. Speaker, I had the honor and privilege of attending Young Harris College, and I'm very familiar with this area. And I was blessed to hear about these stories, and I've always heard about the story of how Miss Miller hauled these rocks up from the stream to build her home. And it was that experience, that house, that became symbolic of Zell Miller's rugged independence. After he graduated from Young Harris College, Zell Miller continued his education at Emory University in Atlanta. But shortly after he arrived there, he found that he wasn't really focusing on his studies. In fact, in one of the many books that he wrote, Core Values, he writes about waking up in jail in Young Harris, drunk as a skunk. He tells that story in that book. I've read the book and I remember that story. Well, shortly after that experience, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1953. And later he attributed much of his success to both the discipline he learned as a Marine and the independence that he learned from his mother. He married Shirley Carver in 1954, and the couple had 2 sons. In 1956, he enrolled at the University of Georgia, where he earned a bachelor's and a master's degree in history. And in 1959, he took a teaching position at Young Harris College and returned to his hometown as a professor of history and political science. Mr. Speaker, members of the Georgia delegation are here tonight, and I'm going to yield to them. I'm going to pause. I'm going to continue on and tell you about the rest of this outstanding gentleman's life. But at this point, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to recognize one of my fellow delegation members from Georgia, Representative Drew Ferguson, and yield to him for what time he shall need.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I first want to thank my colleague, Representative Carter from Georgia's 1st District, for organizing this hour to honor one of Georgia's great leaders, former United States Senator and Georgia Governor Zell Miller. Governor Miller's leadership in our state led to the creation of something that we hold near and dear to our hearts. That is the Hope Scholarship. This scholarship program has helped generations of young Georgians build a bright future for themselves, and that in turn has led to a stronger state for our people. In addition to the Hope Scholarship and many other policy accomplishments, Governor Miller truly embodied the term public servant. He devoted his life to serving our fellow Georgians and sought to leave our state better than he found it. At his funeral, Governor Miller's grandson read a list of 14 life lessons that the governor had written to mark his 70th birthday. This list included a number of important lessons that he wanted to pass along to his family and to others. They included such things as reminding folks not to smoke. He killed his friends way too early. It reminded people to be polite, to be on time. One of the lessons that struck me in particular, and I think really describes how Zell Miller sought to live his life, and it reads this: search for your niche. It may take years, although often it occurs early in life. There's something out there that you can do better and easier than everybody else, and you'll have a knack or a talent for it. Find it. It's there. And when you do, others will beat a path to your door to get you to do it for them. Governor Miller certainly found his niche in his lifetime, and that niche was serving his fellow Georgians. Using his talents, he created a program that helped thousands of students achieve their dream of a college education, a legacy that will live on through each successive class of Hope Scholarships. We are eternally grateful for his service and his commitment to our great state and to ensuring that future generations will have greater opportunities. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Well, thank the gentleman. And you know, the gentleman mentioned something about the Hope Scholarship. Zell Miller was known as Georgia's education governor. He was the founder of the Hope Scholarship. And as the gentleman noted, it's resulted in a number of students who have been able to complete their college degrees in their college careers as a result of the Zell Miller Scholarship and the Hope Scholarship. Before I recognize the next speaker, I want to continue on what I was sharing with you about Zell's early life and the fact that after he got out of the Marine Corps, he went to Young Harris College, and he was a professor of history and political science, but he was something else. He was also a baseball coach. He coached baseball at Young Harris College. I had the privilege of talking to some of his former players. In fact, we just had homecoming up at Young Harris a few weeks ago, and I had the opportunity to talk to Don Harp, a retired Methodist minister who has served for many years on the Board of Trustees at Young Harris College, and who was one of the best baseball players to ever come through Young Harris. And he was telling me a story about how he was a catcher on the baseball team. And they had a lead in a game, and he was calling the signals, and he said there was this, they were ahead by 1 run, and in the 2 outs in the top of the 9th inning, they were about to wrap it up, and he said he called for 2 sinkers in a row. And sure enough, he got 2 strikes on the batter and had an 0-2 count. And he said then he decided he'd call for a fastball. So he called for a fastball, and sure enough, the batter hit it right up the middle. 2 runs scored, and they got behind by 1 run. He said he went back to the bench after that inning, and he said they were behind by 1 run, and he went back to the bench, and he said Zell Miller was coach, and he was sitting on the bench. And he said he motioned to him. He said, "Come over here." He said he came over here, and he said, he sat beside him, and he said, Coach Miller looked at him, he said, "If you ever make another call like that, you'll be sitting here by me the rest of this game." He said he understood right then exactly what he was to do. I also remember talking to one of my colleagues that I served with in the Georgia State Legislature in the Georgia House, Mickey Chanel, who played baseball for Zell at Young Harris College. Mickey was from Greensboro, Georgia. And you know, Mickey told me, he said, I didn't get to play very much. He said, but I remember this one time that my dad traveled up to see me play, and Zell knew he had come. And he said, Zell, let me start that game, because he knew my dad was there. And I could tell how much that meant to Mickey, and he'd always remembered that. And that's just a glimpse of what we're talking about when we're talking about this great man, this great Georgian, this great American. You know, in his early political career, as I mentioned, he was a mayor. He was mayor of Young Harris. He held that position for 2 years, and then he was elected as a state senator. He represented the areas up in North Georgia, Towns County, Union County, Rayburn County, as a state senator. A few years after that, he took a leave from his teaching responsibilities at Young Harris College, and he actually went and he was executive secretary for then Governor Lester Maddox during the time that Lester Maddox was governor from 1968 to 1971. And during the 1970s, Zell Miller was twice named as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention, once in 1972 and again in 1976. In 1971, he was appointed as executive director of the Democratic Party in Georgia, and he served in that capacity until 1973, when he became a member of the State Board of Pardons and Paroles, and he served on that board until 1975. And then in 1975, Zell Miller became lieutenant governor of the state of Georgia. And he actually held that post longer than anyone has ever held that post. He held it for 16 years. In 1980, he ran for a statewide office. He ran for the United States Senate, but he lost in the primary to then the incumbent Senator Herman Talmadge. Over the next 10 years as lieutenant governor, he really worked on his leadership skills. He was presiding as lieutenant governor. He was a presiding officer in the state Senate. As I mentioned earlier, I had the honor and privilege of serving in the Georgia State Legislature for 10 years. And the stories that we heard as members about Zell Miller as the lieutenant governor and the famous Tom Murphy, who served for so many years as Speaker of the House of the state of Georgia, and the battles that those two would have. Zell is this leader of the Senate, and Tom Murphy is the leader of the House. The stories are still told in the Georgia State Legislature, the Georgia State Capitol, about the battles between these two giants of Georgia politics. You know, in 1990, Zell ran for governor of the state of Georgia. He was in a tough race in the Democratic primary. He faced Andrew Young. He won that primary. And then he was elected. He was elected as governor of the state of Georgia, actually defeated Johnny Isakson, who now serves as our senator here, our senior senator in the United States Senate. And before I go on and tell you about his governorship, I'll pause again and yield to another one of my colleagues from Georgia, Representative Hank Johnson. Let me start with Representative David Scott. And I'll have a story to share about his brother-in-law in just a minute, and Zell Miller. But I look forward to hearing about him because I know he's got some great stories about. Give him hell, Zell.
Well, my friend, you've got that right. Zell Miller was my friend, my partner, and my mentor. You know, I got into politics quite a little bit early. Just as I graduated from the Wharton School of Finance, University of Pennsylvania, and landed in Atlanta. 2 years later, getting down here, you mentioned Andy, getting in his campaign. And then 2 years later, there I am, winding up in the Georgia House of Representatives. So my story intersects on so many different angles and ways with that of Zell Miller. And I can truly stand here and tell each of you that I truly loved this man. And I still do. And I would not be standing here as a member of Congress if it weren't for that friendship, that partnership, and that mentorship with Zell Miller. Let me perhaps, I think, as I tell you about this, I'm thinking of a scripture that best sets the story for this great man, that evolves everything, the history and the steps, the many positions, all that he had done. And you know, before I get to that scripture, Zell Miller helped me. I mean, I got there as a young person. I got over in the Senate. My two Senate office mates, one was Paul Coverdale, the other Julian Bond. I mean, and with us three, Zell Miller called us three his three horsemen. It was then that he was laying the foundation for that vision, for the Hope Scholarship. Zell Miller appointed me to be chairman of the Senate Higher Education Committee, first African American at that position. But more than that, he appointed me at that position at a time when he was giving birth to one of the greatest public affairs program in Georgia history, the Hope Scholarship. And for me to be there as the chairman of the Center Higher Education Committee in that pivotal position, and then to be able to go across Georgia in churches and schools and help sell the Hope Scholarship and what it meant. And then that paved the way for me to later become Rules Chairman with Zell's endorsement. So there I was as Rules Chairman, as you know, buddy. Nothing gets on that calendar if it don't get through the Rules Committee. And I was there to make sure none of those bills, because you know it was tough. They had other bills coming to try to remove the Hope Scholarship. And so let me just conclude by sharing with you what his meaning meant to me, and I think to the nation and the world, is best captured in God's first psalm. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord. And in the law of the Lord he does meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of waters, bringing forth his fruit in his due season. And none of his leaves will ever wither, and everything whatsoever he does shall prosper. Such a man was Zell Miller. God bless Zell Miller. And I thank God for sending Zell Miller our way.
I thank the gentleman for sharing that. And I want to share one other thing before I call on the next speaker. And I mentioned that Zell Miller was the baseball coach at Young Harris College when he was a professor up there and on the faculty there. Well, they discontinued the baseball program for a long time. And then when Zell was governor, they actually restarted the baseball program. And Zell had a big role in that. In fact, two stories I want to tell you real quickly. He invited us all to the governor's mansion, those of us who were supporting the baseball program, trying to get it started up. And to kick it off, he had none other than Hank Aaron and Mickey Mantle at the governor's mansion as a benefit to getting the Young Harris College baseball program started again. Not only has that program started again, but it's been very, very successful, producing players such as Nick Markakis, who plays for the Atlanta Braves now, who played at Young Harris College, Charlie Blackmon, playing for the Colorado Rockies. Just a few of the many players that went to Young Harris who are playing in the major leagues right now. I also want to share with you very quickly his love of baseball, because when he was governor, Phil Niekro, the great knuckleball pitcher of the Atlanta Braves, was inducted into baseball's Hall of Fame. Zell actually hosted a trip to the Hall of Fame during the time that he was to Cooperstown, during the time that he was being inducted. And my wife and I and my two oldest sons were honored and able to go on that trip. And I can remember being at the Hall of Fame with Zell Miller. And I can remember the emotions and how proud he was of a Georgian, of Phil Niekro, of an Atlanta Brave being inducted into the baseball's Hall of Fame. Just another one of the great memories that I have of Zell Miller. At this time, I want to recognize another member of our delegation to share with us his remarks, and that's Rick Allen from Georgia's 12th District. And I'll yield to him for what time he may consume.
Well, Congressman Carter, thank you for putting together this special order to honor someone who probably everybody in Georgia has been touched by in some way or another. Because I rise today to honor the life and legacy of what we all consider a true legend in the state of Georgia, former Governor Zell Miller. You know, he was known for his quick wit, and he had a deep love for the state of Georgia, and of course, obviously up from the mountain area in North Georgia. He was always willing to do what was right for our state, and this state that we all love to call home. Zell Miller's service to our country began at a young age, and was mentioned he served in the United States Marine Corps, where he later attained the rank of sergeant. Upon returning home from his military service, Zell received degrees, as we said, in history from the University of Georgia, and would eventually use that education to teach college at his hometown in Young Harris, Georgia. I did not know that he was the baseball coach, but I was glad to learn that. You know, after only a few years of teaching, Zell was called to run for public office, as we said, as mayor, state senator, lieutenant governor, and later governor, then U.S. senator. It is hard to imagine who has had a greater impact on the lives of Georgians. Zell was one of those true conservatives. As governor, Zell Miller will be remembered for his great accomplishments, as we mentioned, of the Hope Scholarship Program and funding it with the Georgia Lottery, which has surpassed $10 billion in total financial aid assistance to Georgia students. Let me repeat that. $10 billion in total financial aid assistance to Georgia students. Because of the Hope Scholarship, Georgia higher education is now a national leader in entry requirements and graduation rates. A quick story about the University of Georgia. On visiting that campus, we learned, and this was when we were doing our higher education bill, and we were told that you know, graduation rates were 55 to 60% across the country. Well, in visiting the University of Georgia now, that has been under the Hope Scholarship since Governor Miller served his term, we learned that the entry requirements, buddy, was 1,300 on the SAT, and you had to be at the top of your class to get into the University of Georgia. Now, this is 80, and the student body is 80% of Georgians. They only accept 20% from out of state. So you can imagine how much more difficult it is to get into the University of Georgia out of state. But the amazing statistic is that the graduation rate is 95%. And those students either get a job upon graduation or go on to higher education. An amazing accomplishment for the University of Georgia, and largely because of the opportunities presented to Georgians through the Hope Scholarship. Because of the Hope Scholarship, like I said, Georgia is now a national leader in education. Zell Miller will always be known as the education governor, and he helped build a foundation that, of course, our state enjoys today. During his tenure, he also played a pivotal role in bringing the Children's Medical Center to the Medical College of Georgia at Augusta University. We have a special attachment, as our family does, as many families across the state of Georgia, to the Medical College of Georgia. Our 12th grandchild was born 8 weeks premature. Her first year of life she spent in that medical center, off and on, to deal with being born premature. Our family, among many families in the state of Georgia, thank Zell Miller for his foresight in bringing the Children's Medical Center of Georgia to the 12th District. It means so much to the health and welfare of families in that area. Zell Miller established Georgia as a state to watch, and his hard work paid off. Georgia has been named for 5 years running as the #1 state to do business. Now, folks, you don't attain that rating unless you have one of the top education systems in the country. Zell Miller was the governor who gave Georgia hope. He will be dearly missed, and his legacy will live on forever. And I am one person that is glad that I knew him, and I thank him for what he has done for my family and for fellow Georgians. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and before I recognize our next speaker, I want to mention one of the things that Zell was famous for, and that was that he wrote a number of books. He was an author. In fact, the first book he ever wrote in 1976 chronicled really him growing up in the mountains. The name of the book was The Mountains Within Me. And that book had a very special meaning to me personally. You see, he talked about Young Harris College, and he equated Young Harris College as being like a shoe factory because things come out of there in pairs. And that meant a lot to me because that's where I met my wife. She was my chemistry lab partner. We came out as a pair, and we've been a pair. In September, it will be 40 years. He also wrote a number of other books. I mentioned earlier that he wrote the book about his experience in the Marine Corps, core values. Everything you need to know I learned in the Marines. He wrote that in 1996, and there's 12 chapters in that book, and each chapter is devoted to a particular trait that he developed during his years in the Marine Corps. For instance, courage, neatness, discipline, and pride. He also wrote another book, Great Georgians, that was published in 1983. And another one that he wrote was They Heard Georgia Singing, about all the famous singers who came from the state of Georgia, a great book. And by the way, in that book, he chronicles two musicians who came from Young Harris College, Ronnie Millsap and Tricia Yearwood, both Young Harris College alums. As you can tell, I'm very proud of Young Harris College. It's my alma mater. It changed my life. Zell Miller changed my life. I'll go on later, but before I do, I want to take this time to recognize another Georgian who's here with us to pay his respects, and that's Representative Hank Johnson, and I'll yield to him the time that he will consume.
I thank my friend Buddy Carter, and for the record, I want it to be known that it was he who called me yesterday to find out what color suit and tie I was going to wear. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today to pay tribute to a great Georgian and a great American, former Georgia Governor and U.S. Senator Zell Miller, who died at the age of 86 in March. He was a North Georgia mountain boy of humble beginnings who was raised by a single parent after his daddy died when he was just 2 weeks old. He was raised in a house that his mama built with her own hands. Former presidents, governors, and dignitaries from all over the country and the world have honored Mr. Miller, who launched the state's Hope Scholarship and led Georgia into the 21st century. A true statesman who served Georgia and his country as first a United States Marine, then as mayor of Young Harris, later serving as a state senator, thereafter as lieutenant governor, and then as governor, and finally as United States Senator. Zell Miller dedicated his life to public service. He was a man physically compact and a bit short, but he walked tall and he walked strong, and he left a towering legacy. A small-town mountain boy from the little town of Young Harris, Zell Miller made a big impact on the affairs of Georgia and indeed the affairs of the nation. Zell Miller left a huge impact on Georgia's judicial system. He literally changed the face of the state bench. I'd like to submit for the record an article I found of particular interest from the Fulton County Daily Report dated March 23, 2018, by managing editor Jonathan Ringel. The article was entitled, "The Late Zell Miller Diversified the Bench." Zell Miller was the first governor to appoint a significant number of minorities and women to the Georgia bench. Zell Miller should be remembered for actually desegregating Georgia's courts. As the Daily Report article outlines, by the time Zell Miller left the governorship in December of 1998, he had appointed 37% of Georgia's 287 trial and appellate court judges. Those numbers include 4 of the 10 judges on the State Court of Appeals and 5 of the 7 state Supreme Court justices. Zell Miller appointed an African-American female as the first African-American to ever serve on the Georgia Supreme Court. 25 of Governor Miller's appointments were of African Americans. 42 of his judicial appointments were of women. 11 were African American women, meaning he added 56 black and female judges to the bench in his 8 years. It's a fact that Zell Miller appointed more African Americans to judgeships in Georgia than all previous Georgia governors combined. In addition, Governor Zell Miller appointed an African American to serve as Georgia's Attorney General, making that African American the first African American state attorney general in the nation. It's a remarkable record for any governor, let alone one from the Deep South. And one of the first counties where he began to diversify the bench is my home circuit, the Stone Mountain Judicial Circuit. As Governor, Zell Miller appointed as State Labor Commissioner, the first African American to ever hold a non-judicial constitutional office in Georgia, and Zell Miller appointed more African Americans to more state boards than any other Georgia governor. As Executive Secretary for Governor Lester Maddox from 1968 to 1971, Zell Miller was credited with exerting a moderating influence on Governor Maddox, a segregationist, and spurring him to appoint blacks to his administration, which he did. As governor, Zell Miller led an unsuccessful effort back in 1993 to remove the Confederate battle emblem from the state flag, and he pushed legislation providing more money for public schools and scholarships for high school students. In fact, Governor Miller raised teacher pay in Georgia by 6% for 4 successive years. 4 successive years, 6% each year. By the time he stepped down after his second term of governor, Zell Miller was one of the most popular politicians in Georgia's history, leaving office with an astounding 85% approval rating. So I thank the gentleman from Georgia's 1st Congressional District, my friend Buddy Carter, for inviting me here this evening to provide a few remarks about the passing of this Georgia lion, Zell Miller, who did a lot of good for our state and for our people. And I truly appreciate him for that. And thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I'll yield back to the gentleman from the 1st District.
I thank the gentleman for sharing his thoughts. Before I recognize our next speaker, I want to speak just for a second on a couple of things about the time that Zell spent as governor of the state of Georgia. And as you just heard Representative Johnson mention, he left, and I think it's important to understand, when he left office, he had an 85% approval rating. Who in the world gets an 85% approval rating? He was the most popular governor in the nation when he left office. But I do want to share with you that that was not always the case. It was tough because, after all, we are talking about give 'em hell Zell. When he was first, you've heard many of the speakers mention the Hope Scholarship. And again, we're talking about Georgia's education governor here, the father of the Hope Scholarship. But remember, the Hope Scholarship came about as a result of the lottery, the Georgia State Lottery, which there were a lot of people who were opposed to that. Remember, I've told you about being at Young Harris College. Young Harris College is a Methodist school. There were a lot of people who supported Zell who were opposed to what some considered to be gambling. Zell pressed on. He knew how important it was. That was his tenacity. That was his ruggedness. He didn't let that get in the way. And thank goodness he didn't. He also, in 1992, he was very important to Bill Clinton's campaign to secure the Democratic U.S. presidential nomination. Played an important role in that. In fact, he also spoke at the Democratic National Convention. And that's where they had the posters all throughout the convention and said, give them Hail Zell. They were distributed among the delegates as Miller gave a speech that was critical of U.S. President George H.W. Bush's administration. Later that year, he also actively campaigned for Clinton, and Clinton carried the state of Georgia. Representative Johnson also mentioned something that's very important to remember as well. Zell was not easily elected to his second term. That's because he took it upon himself to do the right thing and to try, although it was unsuccessful at that time, to try to change the state flag of Georgia and to take the Confederate emblem off of that state flag. Later it was done, many years later, and I can remember Zell saying, well, we might not get it passed, and it might not be attributed to me, but maybe I'll get an asterisk. Well, I don't know if he ever got an asterisk, but I'm going to give him an asterisk tonight. He deserves an asterisk for that effort. At this time, I want to recognize another great Georgian, another member of our delegation, Representative Sanford Bishop, and I'll yield to him for what time he may consume.
I thank the gentleman from the 1st District of Georgia for recognizing me and for hosting this special order to honor my friend and mentor, Zell Miller. Mr. Speaker, Zell Miller was a titan in Georgia, and a man that I was humbled and honored to call a friend and a mentor. He was an extraordinary statesman, a true public servant. He served as a sergeant in the Marines, the mayor of Young Harris, a Georgia state senator, lieutenant governor, U.S. senator for the state of Georgia. Now, as a newly elected state representative of the 94th District of Georgia in 1977, I had very little to do at the state capitol after the session ended and my committee meetings were over. Somehow I found myself hanging out in the office of the lieutenant governor, where his press secretary was from my hometown of Columbus, who was on loan from the Columbus Ledger-Inquirer to serve lieutenant governor. I got to know Zell. I got to learn from his example. And from him, I even developed an appreciation for country music. I witnessed in Zell Miller a public servant with extraordinary integrity, courage, and character. 14 years later, he became governor, and I became a member of the Georgia State Senate. In that term as a state senator, I was appointed to be the chairman of the K through 12 subcommittee of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Education. And I got to work very closely with Zell Miller because, after all, he was the education governor. That year, Georgia was the beneficiary of a windfall as a result of a lawsuit with some utilities, and there were several $1 million that were unexpectedly put into the state coffers. Zell Miller had to make a determination of how the state would spend that money. And being the far-sighted visionary that he was, he decided that we needed to bring our state into the computer age. And so he used it to create a computer network statewide to enhance the educational opportunities for our colleges and universities and our state's public libraries, establishing the Galileo Computer Network, establishing the groundwork for distance learning and for telemedicine. I was very proud as the chair of the Education Subcommittee of the State Senate to work with him in making that happen. Not only that, but we worked to establish pilot programs that year for teaching foreign languages in elementary schools. Zell Miller will perhaps be best remembered for the Hope Scholarship, as you've heard, which helped to establish scholarship money and to direct money raised from the state lottery to the college tuition for Georgia students. To date, the program has provided over $10 billion in scholarship funds to 1.8 million eligible Georgia students. These investments in education are continuing to pay dividends for the state of Georgia. Zell Miller was a true servant, and he was an advocate for Georgia. He was an advocate for humankind. My wife Vivian and I offer his wife Shirley and their family and friends and loved ones our most sincere condolences for his loss. But we are all so grateful that he touched our lives. In closing, I just want to quote the words of a poem that I think is so fitting as we remember the life of Zell Miller. A tree that never had to fight for sun and sky and air and light, that stood out in the open plain and always got its share of rain, never became a forest king, but lived and died a scrubby thing. A man who never had to toil by hand or mind in life's turmoil, who never had to earn his share of sun and sky and light and air, never became a manly man, but lived and died as he began. Good timber doesn't grow in ease. The rougher storm, the tougher trees, the farther sky, the greater length, the stronger winds, the greater strength. By wind or rain, by sun or snow, in trees or man, good timbers grow. Zell Miller was good timber. He left his mark on young Harris. He left his mark on Georgia. He left his mark on our nation, and he left his mark on the world. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our life sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Zell Miller has left some big footprints, and we and the world are better because he passed this way.
I thank the gentleman for sharing with us his experiences and how special they were. Thank you. Thank you for that. Before I recognize our final speaker, I wanted to go over very quickly about the last part of the 46 years, the 46 political years, or 46 years of political service that Zell Miller had, that he served. In 1999, after he finished his last year as governor, his second term, and he was term limited, he went back to Young Harris College and to the University of Georgia in Emory as a teacher. The following year, then Governor Roy Barnes appointed Zell to the United States Senate after Senator Paul Coverdale died. 4 months later, he ran for that remaining 4 years on that 6-year term, and he was elected as senator from the state of Georgia, and he served in that role. He pledged at that time to carry on the conservative tradition of the late Senator Coverdell, and who was a Republican, of course, and he did that. He co-sponsored then U.S. President George W. Bush's 2001 tax cuts and was adamantly in support of President Bush on the issues of homeland security and the deployment of troops to Iraq at the start of the Iraqi war. You will remember also that he wrote another book, A National Party No More, The Conscience of a Conservative Democrat. It became a national bestseller in the months before the presidential election that year. And of course, in 2004, Democratic Senator from Georgia, Zell Miller, did something that I'm not sure anyone else has ever done. He spoke as a keynote speaker at the 2004 Republican National Convention. In January of 2005, he retired. He retired from the United States Senate, and he returned to Georgia. He resumed his teaching career and continued to write. In fact, in 2005, he wrote A Deficit of Decency. In 2008, the Zell B. Miller Learning Center was established at the University of Georgia and dedicated in his honor. In 2017, Miller's family announced that he suffered from Parkinson's disease and he was retiring from public life. I'm going to pause now and recognize another member of the Georgia delegation, one of my good friends, who he and I served together for 10 years in the Georgia State Legislature, and he is truly one of my best friends here in Washington, and I value our friendship, and I know that he's got a lot of experience with and a lot of stories of Zell Miller as well. So I'll yield to my friend, Representative Barry Loudermilk, for what time he may consume.
Thank you, and first let me thank my good friend, Representative Carter, from the great city of Savannah in the great state of Georgia, for his vision to have this time to honor a true statesman, a legend in the state of Georgia, Zell Miller. You know, it's sad that we wait until someone has left this life to sing their praises and to recognize the tremendous impact that they've had, not only on our lives, but our children and the future lives. And that really defines Zell Miller. I never had the opportunity to work directly with Zell Miller or even serve with Zell Miller, even though I served with other governors. But I knew of Zell Miller. And I think that says a lot about someone that, even though you don't personally know them, but you know of them, signifies the impact that they're having on lives. Zell Miller's death was a tremendous blow for a lot of people in our state. I knew of him from my involvement in politics, and I knew, as Representative Carter said, that he was one of the few, if not only, to be a keynote speaker at both the Democrat and Republican national conventions. That means he was truly bipartisan. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't seem to mean a lot today, but what it meant back then was, I care more about the people of this state, I care more about the people of this nation, and defending the rights and liberties and those things from which I believe in than I do a single party. That was Zell Miller. If you were to go to the place where Zell was laid to rest, and you look at the headstone, as you see in most headstones, you'll find the date of his birth of February 24th, 1923. There'll be a dash followed by the date of his death, March 23rd, 2018. And what's interesting, it isn't the date of his birth or the date of his death that matters, but it's the dash in between those dates that really matter. And I think it's important that we ask ourselves, what are we going to do with that dash? Because we've all been given a dash. Zell Miller used that dash for the good and the right of people. You see, his dash continues today as literally thousands of Georgians were able to complete or actually receive a college education because of his vision for the Hope Scholarship, which is still alive and well today. That dash is part of their lives and their future and their children's lives. Another part of that dash in Zell Miller's lives was the titles that he obtained. I believe titles say a lot about us and say a lot about what we do. His titles included mayor, as he was mayor of the town of Young Harris, as he was lieutenant governor. He was governor. Another title that he proudly used, as my good colleague Buddy Carter uses, he was a Georgia Bulldog. And for those of you who aren't from Georgia, it is not D-O-G, it's D-A-W-G, dog. But also from knowing of this incredible gentleman, there's another title that I believe if we were to talk to him today, it wasn't mayor, lieutenant governor, governor, or even U.S. senator that we would be most proud of his accomplishments, but be that of a United States Marine. You see, his dash is a dash that is living on because of the lives that it affected for so many people. And while so much has been said about Zell Miller, let me close my remarks by saying this. There are very few people today that across our globe or even across our country that can be categorized as a true statesman. One of those is Paul Coverdell, and when Paul Coverdell died in office, the governor of the state of Georgia at that time looked for another statesman to fulfill that seat that was vacated by Paul Coverdell's death. And that statesman was Zell Miller. And if there's one thing that we can gather from all these tremendous stories that we heard about Zell Miller today, is that he loved his country, he loved his state, he loved the people of his country, he loved his God, and he fought for those principles and ideas that he believed in. But even though he may have disagreed with others on certain policy issues, Zell Miller was a statesman who believed in liberty, he believed in freedom for all, and his life is a legacy. I hope that one day when I'm laid to rest, that dash between my birth and my death will just have a portion of the meaning of that of Zell Miller. I also want to thank, again, my dear colleague and friend from Savannah, Georgia, for yielding this time and allowing me to honor another Georgian who has passed 18 years ago. It was 18 years ago in June as Georgia heat blanketed the Inman family as they packed their car for a family getaway in the mountains of North Georgia. It was the Friday before Father's Day when Billy and Kathy Inman, the parents of their son Dustin and their family dog, set off to go on a fishing trip for the weekend. As they headed north, making their way along the wooded, hilly highways that make up that part of my home state, they stopped at a traffic town in the little town of Ellijay, Georgia. But as they waited for the light to turn green, the Inman's family's lives were suddenly and tragically changed. Traveling well over the speed limit at 62 miles an hour, a car driven by Gonzalo Harold Gonzalez slammed into the rear of the Inman's vehicle. The tremendous impact knocked Billy and Kathy unconscious. Kathy, Dustin's mom, remained in a coma for 5 weeks. When she finally regained consciousness, she learned that the injuries she sustained in that wreck were so severe she would be wheelchair bound for the rest of her life. But more tragically, she was told the heartbreaking news that her son, Dustin, was killed by that tremendous impact. Within seconds, their lives were forever changed by the driver who slammed into the rear of their car. And while Kathy would not recover from her injuries, nor would they ever see the smiling face of their dear son again, they could at least ensure justice was served. But soon they would learn that even that would slip through their hands. The car that killed their son Dustin and permanently disabled his mother was driven by Gonzalo Harold Gonzalez, a man who had illegally entered this country. Although illegally in this country, Gonzalez was able to obtain a valid North Carolina driver's license using his Mexican birth certificate and a Mexican matricula consular ID card. When local law enforcement went to the hospital to take Mr. Gonzalez into custody, they found that he had escaped the hospital. As a fugitive from justice, he continued to evade U.S. and local law enforcement and soon reemerged back in the streets in Mexico. Even though the location of Mr. Gonzalez is now known by U.S. and Mexican law enforcement, the family has not been able to get justice for his crime. Under our treaty with Mexico, Mexico does not recognize vehicular homicide as an extraditable offense. The Justice Department has informed the Inman family that there is nothing else they can do. Nothing. After 18 years of grieving the loss of their son and adjusting to a life of permanent disability for Mrs. Inman, Mr. Gonzalez is still evading justice and has yet to pay for his crime. The tragedy could have easily been avoided if Congress had taken border threat and security seriously years ago. This car wreck would have never happened, and Dustin would likely still be with us today. Because of the severity of their injuries, Billy and Kathy were not even able to attend their own son's funeral. Billy will tell you that, yes, he blames the driver of the car for the death of his son, but his hunting buddy, but he also blames the government for ignoring our open and porous borders and for allowing someone who is here illegally to obtain a driver's license. While there have been many speeches given in this chamber on immigration, we have yet to be able to have a vote or even have a debate on what the majority of Americans are demanding, what the president is committed to, and what we as a legislative body should do, and that's to secure our borders. How many more innocent victims, such as Dustin Inman, Kate Steinle, or Sarah Root, and the list goes on, must die before we start taking the safety and security of U.S. citizens seriously and prioritize securing our borders? Not only are our borders a thoroughfare for human trafficking, they are also a distribution channel for cartels who smuggle contraband, dangerous drugs, and weapons that make their way into our communities. They are a portal for dangerous gangs such as MS-13 who bring terror, drugs, and murder to our streets. For too long, we have chosen partisan politics over doing what is reasonable and right, and we put our families' livelihoods at tremendous risk. It's beyond time to take action. It's time for Congress to act. It's time for us to enforce our laws, and it's time to secure our borders, not for our own political victories, but for families such as Billy and Kathy Inman. I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman for that. And Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for allowing the Georgia delegation to pay our respects to a great Georgian, to a great American, Zell B. Miller. Mr. Miller's knowledge and his broad experience in Georgia enabled him to be one of the most popular and successful leaders ever for this state. With the passing of Mr. Miller, of Zell Miller, Georgia has truly lost one of its most important servants. Zell Miller was a personal mentor to me. Young Harris College changed my life, as I mentioned earlier. Zell Miller changed my life as he changed the lives of so many Georgians, of so many Americans. I'm so grateful for the wisdom that he shared with all of us. His family remains in my thoughts and prayers, but his policies, his ideals, and his legacy will live on in the state of Georgia for years to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield.
The gentleman yields. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levan, for 30 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to have fun.